Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 54 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and it was a busy day if you were following it on screens as I was. And I say screens in the plural because there were two things going on. There was the proceedings in Halifax with the Mass Casualty Commission itself, and it featured Superintendent, now Chief Superintendent Darren Campbell. And at the same time, well, that was for the bulk of the day. In the same time in the afternoon in Ottawa, there were Public Safety, National Security Committee, Federal Parliament Subcommittee, hearing from other senior officers from, first of all, the Minister, Bill Blair, Public Safety Minister Bill Blair, and Commissioner Brenda Lucki, Chief Superintendent Chris Leather, who was the number 2 officer in Nova Scotia at the time of the shootings, and retired Assistant Commissioner Lee Bergerman, who was the head RCMP officer in Nova Scotia at the time of the shootings in April of 2020. So Chief Superintendent now, formerly just Superintendent Darren Campbell, was the number 3 officer in Nova Scotia at the time. You may have seen him, recognize him from some of the press conferences. Although interestingly, I think today he wasn't wearing his the blue uniform of the senior RCMP officers. He was wearing just a regular business suit, which seems to be some. I wonder, how these people make these decisions, but it seemed to be a subtle attempt to distance himself from the other more senior officers. There was a lot of that going on today. These officers, we heard. Corporal Mills, described these officers, the white shirts at this higher level, as sort of political actors in their own sense. And you could see that today. I mean, these were all the senior officers from Nova Scotia at the time, plus Commissioner Lucki, the National Commissioner, all sort of aware that things didn't go well, that they're under scrutiny, that their performance is being critiqued across the country. And they're each doing sort of a balancing act of deflecting criticism away from themselves personally onto the other senior officers, and at the same time, though, trying to protect the RCMP brand itself in so doing. So, I'll talk about all that in a minute. Just want to mention up front, though, a couple of news articles I read over the weekend and this morning that I think could just draw your attention to. There was a note, actually, this was just on Twitter this morning, of an email that went around to the parties on Friday from the restorative justice people in Nova Scotia, advising that the restorative justice process for Lisa Banfield, James Banfield, and Brian Brewster for supplying ammunition to the gunman, that restorative justice process is now complete. It was complete as of July 19th. So that means to me that it was clear that Miss Banfield's participation, to whatever extent you would agree she participated, her testimony was the final or perhaps the only condition of her restorative justice, which she, to a very minimal extent, fulfilled. Okay, so that was one note. The other is a story in the Herald from Francis Campbell, who I think is doing a great job covering the Mass Casualty Commission, summarizing the submissions from lawyer Erin Breen, representing a coalition of women's groups. Her submissions on Friday, I thought were really good. I was listening to them on the telephone as she was giving them. What she did was go through all of the experiences that Wortman had with the police, reports, potential reports, an officer coming to see him, his friend, the police officer coming to inspect whether he has weapons, all these things that showed how he was able to get away with things. Now, she uses the word privilege, which of course these days is a loaded term, can mean many things, but just goes through step by step how his position of wealth, of, being a white guy, having some friends in the RCMP, all of these things seem to insulate him from RCMP scrutiny, from any police intervention in a serious manner. In her comparison was, well, if this was a black or indigenous man, would the police have treated him the same way? So that's something I'd advise looking into. And the last one is the weekly column that Stephen Kimber does for the Halifax Examiner. He is still expressing some hopes in yesterday's column that the Mass Casualty Commission will make a difference, pointing back, drawing on the Marshall inquiry recommendations, which led to changes within the prosecution system in Nova Scotia. So it depends on the quality of the report and the public engagement thereafter. So there's still some hope. All right, well, that's perhaps a fair point, but we haven't seen a lot of intervention or any real public commentary from the commissioners themselves that suggest that they're really going to dig into this. Yes, the reports, the foundational documents, the disclosure that's on the Mass Casualty Commission website is, if you read it, critical of the RCMP performance. So is that going to be reflected in recommendations, and is that then going to lead to political action? Well, that all depends on public engagement with the report, with the conclusions. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so on to today. I'll start with Darren Campbell. So he was asked some about the operational elements of it, and then some of his actions afterwards, dealing with the press conferences and informing the public. So Darren Campbell did mention one of his first things was that after the incident, he had made a referral. Now he's the third officer in charge here, but he made a referral to the national RCMP for a performance review to be done of the Nova Scotia RCMP's response to the events of the mass casualty. So he told his next up in line, Chris Leather, but he did not tell, it sounds like, Lee Bergerman that he was doing this. So, it's in a way, I think Superintendent Campbell trying to get out ahead of the story, a little bit ahead of the criticism, and say, hey, I was the one that asked for the review. You don't look at me. It wasn't me that was the problem. I'm the one that was looking for people to, do an analysis of it. So it's a virtue signaling exercise in a sense, and I think that was part of what Superintendent Campbell was doing throughout his testimony today. Operationally, okay, he mentioned the alert ready system, and he said, that just wasn't in the toolbox, but that would be something for the critical incident commander, Staff Sergeant West, to decide. It was his responsibility if that was to be done. And then also he talked about communication lapses so Jamie Blair gives this report right away saying the name, Gabriel Wortman, he's a denturist, my neighbor, he has an RCMP car, all that stuff. Well, why didn't that get picked up and sink in with people that were in positions of decision making? And he seemed to sort of shift the blame back to Ms. Blair a little bit there, and saying she may not have been sufficiently clear in her descriptions, which I think, I was watching the live stream, but I could kind of sense that people in the room didn't like that answer, and I can imagine why. I mean, it's in the position where she was in to give that much information, I thought was pretty impressive. So to suggest that, he said respectfully, but he was still shifting the blame back to her, that wasn't quite appropriate, I didn't think, for him to do so. Superintendent Campbell's whole evidentiary approach seemed to be standing back and apart from the operational side of it, just to say, hey, I was just as disappointed in everything as you were, and sort of take that stance as creating some distance between the efforts and his own role. But of course, he was central to the following part, which was the press conferences, information given to the public, and he kept trying to portray himself as one that wants to provide as much information to the public as possible, yet we know that he was involved in these decisions in the press conferences where information was coming out in very dribs and drabs. It wouldn't take very many questions, weren't providing information, held very few press conferences. Now, he does point to one example where there was a request from CBC, the Fifth Estate, to do a documentary and get RCMP participation, and Darren Campbell wanted to participate, but was overruled by Commissioner Lucki. Now, it was interesting because I was watching the two screens at once, and Brenda Lucki was in Ottawa talking about her wanting to be open and transparent, and that's why she wanted them to talk about the weapons that were being used, talk about the make and models, give a proper account of how many people had died and provide their names, give as much information as possible. And at the same time, I was listening to Darren Campbell on the other screen talking about how Commissioner Lucki had refused permission or overruled, vetoed the participation in the documentary. So that was interesting. Now he was sort of presenting himself as a paragon of disclosure and information to the public. Yet we know that they withheld all that information. So a lot of back and forth on that question. Now Commissioner Lucki, in her comments to the committee, sort of supported Commissioner Blair. Minister Blair mentioned that he didn't apply any political pressure, he didn't interfere with any operations, and I take that to mean that there's no paper trail of any such instruction, so he's probably safe in saying so. Commissioner Lucki said that she didn't feel that it was interference on Minister Blair's part, that he was just asking questions, and that she can handle questions. If she felt there was a directive coming, it would have been obvious and clear that that was a directive and not just asking questions. But she had indicated to him that they were going to release as much information as possible. So her disappointment with the Nova Scotia RCMP was a broad one, of which the failure to release the makes and models of the firearms was just one example. So that was the way she portrayed her behavior on the conference call that Darren Campbell sort of publicized a few weeks ago with the release of his notes from that. Now, Darren Campbell in his evidence was talking about, all right, well, why didn't you release it? And he talked about this ongoing investigation. Well, we learned that there really wasn't an ongoing investigation. Darren Campbell, to his credit now, has said in his testimony today they should have been looking into more, and he thinks they still should look into more of the cross-border weapon access situation. But his definition of an ongoing investigation is any investigation which hasn't been solved. Any crime that hasn't been solved, if the file is still not solved and it hasn't closed, well, then it's ongoing, in the sense that new information could possibly come in at any time. Well, I don't think that's what most people would understand when they hear, oh, there's an ongoing investigation, we can't release information. They think of something a little more active. And, an active investigation is one where people are working on it every day. They're knocking on doors. They're trying to gather evidence. But ongoing, in the sense that the RCMP then feel they can withhold information, just means anything that isn't resolved yet. So the next time I think you hear somebody saying, well, we have to, we can't do that because of an ongoing investigation. Well, is it ongoing or is it active? Because based on ongoing, that could mean any investigation. So interesting there. Getting back to the Fifth Estate question and the issue of Brenda Lucki versus the Nova Scotia RCMP, I wonder, but Commissioner Lucki was not asked about this. I imagine she will be when she appears in August, the end of August, that, she didn't want the Nova Scotia RCMP participating in a CBC documentary because she had watched their press conferences and they were all disastrous and withholding information and didn't, they weren't forthcoming, all those things, and didn't want them out there stepping on their foot any more than they already had. So maybe that's why we'll hear from Commissioner Lucki late August, I think around the 22nd, 23rd of August. So, all right, so that's what happened today. Darren Campbell is going to be cross-examined. There may be a little bit of that still coming this afternoon. They are on break now discussing that question. But the bulk of the cross-examination, Darren Campbell, is going to happen tomorrow. That is Tuesday. I'll be there to watch it and bring you a reaction. I'm going to be there on Wednesday in person to watch Chief Superintendent Chris Leather testify. So if anybody's around and watching the proceedings in person, come by and say hello, and be happy to meet people that are watching this on a daily basis. So until then, until tomorrow, I'll leave it at that. And so thank you again for watching. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.